Good evening and welcome to today's Contra Mundum, our weekly look at issues affecting Christian life in the 21st century. Excuse me one moment, just while I finish getting ready. Things are not quite set up. There we are. Okay, everything's working good. Now, you may recall that last week we reflected somewhat on existentialism, a form of philosophy which has had quite a significant impact, I would say, on the development of contemporary thought, particularly in recent years. And we went over the sort of principles of existentialism. And in many ways, what I would like to do this evening is just again to talk about some of those key existentialist concepts and perhaps demonstrate how they are manifest in the thinking and the attitudes and the approaches of many today, and then of course give the contrasting and the appropriate Orthodox and Catholic response. So you may recall that one of the ultimate, this is the kind of overall existentialist concept, is the meaninglessness of life. Remember that for the existentialists, there is no God. Nietzsche, of course, who famously declared God is dead. So for the existentialist, there is no God. There is no meaning to life. There is only the loneliness of being a thinking individual. In other words, to all intents and purposes, the only thing that matters is me. Now, I said last week that this was a kind of corruption almost of Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am." in the sense that for the existentialist, that really is the summation for them of anything. I think, therefore I am. For them, that means that literally I am, because I have consciousness, I exist. But that is all it means. That is all it means. Now, quite obviously, you can see how pessimistic and rather nihilistic perhaps that sounds. But if you consider, if you think, as they do, that ultimately there is no point, no meaning to our existence, that there is no God, there is no objective system of morality, and that the only thing you can be sure of is your own existence, well, then you can see why, particularly for some, especially, they suffer from then a nihilism. Now, of course, for us as Christians, as Orthodox Catholics, we know that none of that is true. None of that is true. We know that God exists, and we know that each and every one of us exists for his purpose and will. And this, my brothers and sisters, is important for us to remember and to be able to explain to others, because the same is true not just for ourselves but for others as well. For us as Christians, nobody exists without reason or purpose. Nobody exists whom God has not intended to exist. That God has not from all eternity desired to exist. Remember these wonderful affirmations that we hear in Scripture from Psalm 139. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. And of course, from Jeremiah, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. So for us as Christians, we know and understand that everybody exists for a purpose and a will that is known to God. And in many ways, the challenge of the Christian life is to realize and discover, to discern for ourselves why God made me. What is the purpose? What is his will for my life? And as Christians, we understand that true fulfillment comes from that. Now we can spend, as most of us do most of the time, we can spend our time and our lives seeking after earthly pleasures that certainly for a time, for a season, will seem to satiate our sense of self or our desire for pleasure or satisfaction or even indeed happiness. But as we get older in life, we begin to realize and to recognize that Scripture again is speaking truth when it tells us that this life is fleeting. And we learn with experience that relationships come and go, that people come in and out of our lives, that situations and different things pass, that really the only constant for us in this life is God. Everything else in this life comes and goes, lives and dies. But the only thing that is constant is God. So when we are approached with these sorts of suggestions that life is ultimately meaningless and that there is no God and that the only reliable proof of our own existence is our own consciousness, then we ought, my brothers and sisters, as Christians, be able to respond by saying, no, there is a reason for all of us to be alive. God is the only constant in life. And thus, we are not ever lonely. We are aware that as human beings, we were created for relationship with God, and indeed for relationships with each other. Remember, when we read in Genesis the creation account, God makes this and sees that it is good. He makes that and sees that it is good. He makes man, and this is the first time we hear a kind of negative when he says, oh, it is not good for man to be alone. And so he creates Eve. The point is, we are made for a relationship. Primarily, a relationship with God. But also, too, it is in our nature as we were created to live in relationship with others, to be able to relate to others. Which means the whole point of our existence cannot be solely constrained and confined to our own sense of self, but needs must necessarily be open and responsive to others. Now, one of the, again, key concepts in existential thought is this notion of absurdity. What human beings encounter when they come into contact with the world. Absurdity is brought about because the human instinct to seek order and meaning is frustrated by the refusal of the world to be orderly or meaningful. Let me just repeat that again. Absurdity is brought about because the human instinct to seek order and meaning is frustrated by the refusal of the world to be orderly or meaningful. Now, this seems to me, as I hope it does to you, to be a very strange concept. If, as they suggest, it is a human instinct to seek order and meaning, then that would seem to suggest that order and meaning is an inherent, or we might say innate, characteristic or attribute of humanity. This in itself seems to speak to the truth that, for example, St. Paul presents to us in his epistles, this notion of the natural law, and this notion that we can know of and can recognize and come to a conception and in a recognition of God and of a sense of order through observation of the natural order. Now, it is true, of course, that it is not necessarily always immediately obvious to us how the rules of nature work in terms of, sometimes we can't understand always just from observation the life of insects or the life of plants or the life of wild animals, etc. However, we do know that those who make an effort and a point to study such things do themselves begin to observe and to recognize regular patterns. Regular, of course, comes from the Latin regula, which means order. So that, it is possible to perceive a sense, not of absurdity, but instead the opposite, a sense of order. And a sense of order itself kind of indicates then the suggestion of purpose and the suggestion of meaning. When things are ordered, they are generally ordered to an end. And we can see from simple, basic scientific method and simple observations ourselves of the way things are, that things do seem, on the whole, to have an ultimate purpose and an ultimate logical, as it were, conclusion to the way things work. I mean, think of the complementarity, for example, of in biology of the sexes. Think of the anatomy of male and female. There's clearly an order in the way that those two things can come together for procreation. So this notion, this existentialist notion of absurdity would, I would counter, not seem to be borne out in any serious observation and contemplation obvious to us in the evidence of creation around us. We can recognize order in the gradual and progressive development of our own lives and in the lives of living things. We see that 1 + 1 = 2, 2 + 2 = 4, etc. We see this repeated over and over and over again, particularly in living things. So this notion that then humans live frustrated somehow by the refusal of the world to be orderly or meaningful, I think we can counter by saying that no, perhaps there is only if there is a lack of desire to really observe and to recognize and to study the way things work, because clearly there is order, and if there is order, then there is purpose. And of course, it's true that for us as human beings, that we have an ability, a much greater ability, which is not to say that some animals don't share some aspects or potential for this, but on the whole, they don't. One of the distinguishing things between humanity and the rest and the animal kingdom is, for example, our ability to rationalize and to reason and to think outside the limitations and constraints of our experience, that we are actually able to think things through conceptually without necessarily having experienced things, without necessarily having the empirical evidence immediately to hand, that we are able to think abstractly. Now I can appreciate how, on a superficial level, if one didn't employ that ability, then perhaps one might think that the world was absurd. But it seems to me that, anyone who engages their mind, anyone who accedes to their natural curiosity in observation can easily conclude that no, indeed, there is order and meaning to life, even with or without me, in the sense that I can conceive of the world continuing without me. But that doesn't mean necessarily then that my own existence does not have meaning or purpose. Quite the contrary, because at the same time, I can look back on my life thus far and see the way in which I will have made an impact and had an influence in some small way or more on the lives of others. Particularly, for example, if I was a parent, my children would not exist without me. That in itself then gives meaning and gave a purpose to my life, if only to beget life. But likewise, even if I never sired children, just from the experience of relational interactions with others, one can influence and have an influence in other people's lives. And so that necessarily suggests meaning, hopefully some purpose too. Kierkegaard, one of the existentialists, talks about anxiety, and he says, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. About this, he says, one feels anxiety because you recognize that you and you alone are responsible for your actions. This produces the two-sided feeling of simultaneous dread and exhilaration. In other words, he suggests that this produces anxiety. Well, I suppose to some extent we can say that that's perhaps a truism. It's a true observation. Of course, anyone who is conscientious, will be aware of and recognize that their actions, their words, can indeed often do have consequences. And that, we are ultimately responsible for what we do and what we say. But as to whether or not we necessarily then have to live or experience life in a perpetual state of anxiety, seems to me to be something of a leap. Now, for sure, those of us who live according to an objective sense of morality, i.e. those of us who live our lives as Christians and are trying to conform our lives to God's moral strictures as revealed in the commandments. Yes, of course, when we do something wrong, reference those commandments, then yes, we ought to have, we may experience some anxiety. But of course, one of the comforting aspects about the gospel is that we can always be forgiven. Now, that's not to suggest, of course, because it wouldn't make sense for us to simply, well, actually, on the whole, though, this is what most of us do. We do wrong, knowing we're doing wrong, but we do wrong sometimes with the presumption that we will be forgiven. It's not for nothing that the priest in the confessional dismisses the penitent with the words, "Go in peace and sin no more," echoing, of course, the words of Christ himself, indeed, to the Magdalene. Go in peace and sin no more. Making the point, actually, that we should be thinking to ourselves that we can just that it's okay to carry on going through life sinning and being absolved, sinning and being absolved, though of course in many respects that is a reality for most of us. But what ought to be happening, if we are truly attempting to live our lives conscientiously regarding God's commandments and indeed Christ's teachings, and particularly his admonition for us to strive to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, and to love one another as he has loved us, then of course we ought not to be deliberately repeating the same mistakes. We instead ought to be growing and developing so that we don't fall into that ever-decreasing cycle and pattern of repetitive behavior and vice. But that said, one of the comforting elements of the gospel message of redemption is that if we do sin, if we do fail, as long as we are contrite, and contrition, true contrition, a sincere contrition, must necessarily contain an intention not to repeat the same mistake. As long as we are true in contrition, we will receive absolution and the opportunity to start over and to begin again, to start afresh. Now, with that in mind, that means for us as Orthodox Catholics, there is no reason really for us to live, as the existentialists suggest, in a kind of perpetual state of anxiety, being concerned about the consequences of our actions. Because we have this access to forgiveness, this ability to begin again, there is no need for us to carry around, as it were, a perpetual sense of guilt, which is probably what I suspect Kierkegaard means, really, rather than anxiety, but a sense of guilt. Because I do sense, as a pastor, I do sense that a great deal of people, and especially those who are not practicing Christians, especially those who have not come to faith, do live their lives carrying around a great deal of baggage, a great deal of guilt for past mistakes and failures. And for sure, carrying that around will, of course, have overall a negative impact and influence upon one's life. See, contrary to what many people would like to think and like to suggest, the truth is that anyone who is attuned to themselves and to their conscience does know the difference between right and wrong. There is, as St. Paul suggests, an innate sense within us of what is right and what is wrong. And so for sure, many people who do not, who have not embraced the gospel, can indeed live their lives perhaps in a perpetual state of some stress and anxiety because of the guilt that they are carrying around with them. Now, here again, we would say this is the positive aspect of our faith compared to the negativism of existentialism, where if there is no God, then there is no opportunity for forgiveness, unless, of course, you go to the person you have offended directly and seek forgiveness. And how many people generally are prepared to do that? It seems to be something that we kind of naturally, it seems to be a kind of natural behavior or predisposition that we have that's recognizable in the behavior, for example, of children, of toddlers, that apologizing and saying sorry is not something that comes readily to us. And certainly for many of us would not come, as it were, naturally, even though we would naturally be aware and conscious of that an apology might be owed. It doesn't necessarily follow that left to our own devices, we would necessarily apologize, unless motivated by some particular want ourselves. So if there was a benefit to apologizing, we might make ourselves apologize then. And how often do we see that change in attitude expressed, for example, in young children, when a parent might offer them a bribe to apologize? Oh, well, if I'm going to get something for it, then I'll apologize. But if I think I can get away with it, and most people do what they do, often with the hope and expectation that they will get away with it, then, as it were, left to my own devices, no, I probably won't go out of my way to restore and to bring justice. Of course, justice was the virtue that we discussed on Wednesday in Late Night Catechism. And although, you see, we have, as it were, an innate sense of justice, doesn't mean to say necessarily that left to our own devices, we all would seek to restore justice especially when it's we ourselves who have behaved poorly. But it certainly seems today to be a particular issue. For many, particularly it would seem of younger generations, being brought up by comparison to, say, people over the age of 40. Younger generations today who have largely been brought up in quite a secularized society, would seem to have an impoverished sense of justice, would seem to have, in many ways, a skewed sense of what is right and wrong. And that's largely because so many of them have been brought up without that dimension of religion and of faith that otherwise would have brought out that innate sense of consciousness, of conscientiousness. And this is beginning to be a problem in our society today. I mean, to give a very local example, but on social media, I was reading only a couple of days ago that a new halls of residence for university students in a heavily dense populated residential area. There are problems because the freshers, the new intake, the new crop of university students this year, in part because of the COVID restrictions and limitations on the ability for social mobility, are partying, and partying at home, but are partying well into the early hours of the morning, despite appeals and protestations from other local residents. The young people concerned the young people do not seem to be concerned. And indeed, there were many commenting on the post, basically sort of suggesting that that these young people did not need to be concerned. Why should they be concerned? Many suggesting, oh, well, because they're students, that's how students behave. Therefore, nothing you can do about it. What was lost then, of course, was the social dimension, that relational aspect of our humanity. And this is what we seem to be seeing more and more. The lack of and inability of so many young people today to think relationally, except in terms of reciprocity. Unless they perceive that they will get something from it, it's not often that they will conform themselves to an agreeable way of behaving when asked to. And it would seem from the anecdotal evidence that these local residents were commenting that for some years this has become more and more of a problem each year. And that ultimately it would seem that the only way to address the situation, or the only way the situation in times past has been addressed, is when the university has been contacted directly, and when the university has then threatened expulsion. Only then does moderation apparently manifest itself in the relevant young people's behaviors. But notice again, it's still that sense of reciprocity. It's still pivotal on reciprocity. What I will or won't get out of something determines what I will or won't do about something. So that certainly is something we can perceive. But this may speak to that other aspect within existentialism of alienation. The suggestion that there's a sense that one is living as a stranger in the world, or even a stranger to oneself. The suggestion that many aspects of existence can be alienating. One of the sources, as they try to suggest, and we've discussed above, was absurdity. And the suggestion that, ironically, the stories and systems developed by philosophy and religion to address that absurdity can themselves be just as alienating. It's certainly true that an increasing problem, an increasing phenomena in our society today at large is loneliness. More and more and more people are feeling lonely, are feeling isolated. I was at a presentation in the House of Lords a couple of years back, where some quite shocking statistics were revealed about the levels of perceived loneliness that people are experiencing in our society today. And it would seem, if I were to use the term alienation, it would seem to me to be really because it is alien to us, to our true sense of who we are as humanity, to live in a non-relational way with others, but which seems to be such a factor of today's society. Now, that can be in part because, again, if there is no God, if there is no reason, no compunction to have a concern for one's neighbor, if there is no need to be worried about the other, then one can see why so many people are indeed living their lives essentially in a self-focused, in essentially a selfish sort of way and mentality. And this will then necessarily result in a form of alienation of oneself from others, because to live your life in such a blinkered way is going to induce that sense of loneliness. Now, is it, and I realize this is a little bit ironic because of this medium, but is it the rise, in a sense, of virtual reality that has enabled this situation, this scenario to appear, to develop? It's part of the reason why there is so much less relational activity or desire for interaction with others. Is this as a result of increasing use and dependence on the internet and on social media? And of course, there is great harm, can be great harm. If one's only experience of relational behavior is online. Because, of course, one may literally alienate oneself from the rest of physical society. And that in itself, of course, will then have an effect on one's ability to be able to interact with others in the real world. One of the things that we can all relate to is the difference in the way that people relate to one another online to the way they would in person. One only has to read sometimes the kind of comments that people will put to opponents and people they disagree with on, for example, Twitter, or contentious threads elsewhere on social media and Facebook. And people will address each other and speak to each other in ways in which they would not if they were discussing the same thing in one-on-one, in a personal, physical, relational context. But one can see if one's only sense of interaction, if one's only experience of interaction, if one's only way of relating to others is via virtual reality, via gaming, via social media, via the internet, one can indeed see how perhaps even unintentionally, but one will lose the ability to develop relational skills. And for those who live in a virtual reality, in many ways it seems to me that this is really what existentialism speaks to. Although when first conceived of, the virtual reality, we would have said in old times, was in their head. Now, of course, it's become more of a reality in this virtual sense, because there is so much that occurs in the virtual, i.e. via the internet, that transcends and transpires into material and physical reality. Like you see an item on Amazon, you pay for it, and it turns up at your front door, and there you have it. And certainly one can see and appreciate the danger for young people today to not have the skills, not to develop skills that will enable them to interact with others in a reasonable way. You know, the way we behave with one another is a very complicated and developed, evolved, we might say, patterns of behavior that generations over time have lived and developed, so that we know how to behave in certain situations, or we know how to read certain situations and moderate or control our behavior accordingly or appropriately. But you can only experience and learn that in the real world. And if, as so many of our young people are today, spend most of their time in a virtual plane, then that's why they're not going to be able, or they find it difficult to relate in the real world. And that's why the communal dimension to our faith as Christians and as Orthodox Catholics is very important. You know, the tangible, experiential realization of communion, of fellowship, and which ought itself to begin in the family, ought itself to begin in the home. I mean, this is something that as Christians, and particularly as Catholics who have families, real care and attention ought to be given to monitoring the way in which, or rather how much time children might spend on the internet. Now, this is not, of course, to say that, the internet is a negative thing per se in and of itself. Of course it's not. It's an incredibly useful thing. It's amazing how many of us, shall we say, in the older generations have become ourselves dependent and reliant, and appreciate and see the positive benefits. Although, ironically, of course, we do tend to use it in a relational way. And we tend to behave usually in the same way that we might behave off screen. But the internet is a very useful tool. Of course it is. If only because it gives us almost immediate access to 2,000 years of Christian wisdom and spirituality and lived experience of the faith that we can research and study and read for ourselves. But always, as with even with material things, so also we might say with this kind of virtual alternative. The Christian life is about moderation. It is about finding the striking balance, reaching that happy equilibrium. And so often that depends on the way in which we regard things and how we use them. And indeed, when we think about materialism and a detachment from material things, often what we suggest is that we keep in proper perspective the usefulness of particular things, as it were, and only use them for what they may be, as a tool, rather than allow ourselves to become obsessed or possessive of them or obsessed by them. But this phenomena, this issue of alienation, of course, is again not something, though, constrained or limited to the internet and to virtual reality. Because as we see still, again, particularly among younger generations, but sometimes something too that some people don't, as it were, develop from, and it often begins in a recreational way. It often begins in a socialized way, but can and does so often result in a dependency regards narcotics, drugs, alcohol. And ultimately, of course, these things too become alienating. Again, all things in moderation, but when they become excessive and one becomes obsessed by them, indeed even possessed by them, read that dependency, read that desire for perhaps escape, read that desire perhaps to overcome, even ironically, a sense of social inadequacy. Often, however, the result itself is alienating. And again, in many ways, this is, again, this principle of moderation and of achieving balance and equilibrium in the Christian life is actually something that is a positive, because it does help to prevent the circumstances and the conditions into which alienation can develop and loom large. Loneliness, alienation, yeah, for sure. These are very real problems in today's society. But for which our faith, as Catholic Christians, should be able to provide a remedy. as long as we ourselves, of course, are striving to live and achieve a balance and an equilibrium and an awareness and understanding, to avoid ourselves falling into what is so easily done, an ever-decreasing cycle of worry, despair, anxiety, isolation, and alienation. The beauty, perhaps, of our faith, stark contrast to the nihilism of existentialism, is because of our relational concept and understanding of humanity in relationship with God and in relationship with each other. Now, I entitled this conference, What or Who? What or who? Because perhaps of the cause and the problem, or the manifestation of this alienation and this anxiety and this nihilism and this despair and anxiety in our society today, and particularly prevalent in our younger generations, is this confusion about who and what relationally. Who am I? Or what am I? How does what and who I am relate to one another? Particularly at the present time, of course, identity politics features largely in our politics today, but also too I think are beginning to realize the effects of some years of identity ideology and theory, both of the personal and of the social, that has developed over, one could say, particularly the last 50 years. Social identity theory, of course, being the notion that one's sense of self, or an aspect of one's self-identity, is dependent upon the society, the social structure and culture in which one has lived, and identity theory, personal identity theory, or self-identity, sharing in so many ways thoughts or aspects or concepts from existentialism. has developed, we might say, from the eyes of faith, from the position of faith, a very confusing situation today in many people's minds. The kind of weird zeitgeist mentality where an overemphasis on self is beginning demonstrably to have an effect on social cohesion. In other words, the more and more people become focused solely on aspects of themselves, it becomes harder and harder for them to live relationally and interrelationally with others. So, for example, one will have noticed in, say, the last 10 years that in the area of political and social concern regarding, for example, equality and diversity, perhaps a little more than 10 years ago, but the concept of equality and diversity predominantly then was about correcting and addressing imbalances brought about by discrimination, to enable, as it were, a more holistic, or even, dare we say, utopian expression of social cohesion. So as it were, there was an agreed perspective that the ideal society would be able to cope with different attributes, different characteristics of, a multiplicity, as it were, of personal attributes and characteristics, of cultural and even philosophical, but still maintain a sense of a cohesive whole. As opposed to today, where an overemphasis, it seems, of distinguishing individual traits or attributes or characteristics, that overemphasis is actually driving wedges between, and is acting preventatively to realizing a sense of a cohesive whole. But I will leave further reflection on that for next week. So really, I wanted to introduce that today, because again, it is important for us, particularly as Christians in the 21st century, particularly in the present political context and climate. It's important that we have for ourselves, in order that we may be able to help others, that we have a reasonable sense and appreciation of clarity of thought and approach, to be able to assist others to realize the truth, or to be able to discover and discern for themselves the truth, about who they are and how they can reconcile what they may be with ultimately who they ought to be or should strive to become to be in relationship with God and with each other. But as I say, we'll leave that for next time. As always, if you have any questions, please do feel free to leave comments or email. More than happy to consider, and if necessary, provide guidance or direction to other sources or clarity, etc. Please feel free. And also too, please don't be shy to give other feedback as well. If positive or negative, I can take it. But it just indicates to me, as whether or not you find these conferences worthwhile. And then I know whether it's a good use or not of my own time, or how I can better improve it as an exercise for us both. So please do feel free to give feedback. Please feel free to like and even to share if you think others will be helped as well. Well, that was Contra Mundum. Bless you for watching. And tomorrow, of course, is Old Romans Unscripted, same time. And we will be looking at Pope Francis's new encyclical. So it could be quite an interesting discussion. And indeed, some of what we've spoken about this evening, some of what we've touched upon this evening may indeed come out in that discussion tomorrow. So that's Old Romans Unscripted, 6:30 p.m. GMT +1, British Summer Time. We hope to see you then. Otherwise, of course, the Daily Mass and Angelus and Rosary, as usual, are available tomorrow. Meanwhile, take care. God bless. And thank you for watching.
Old Roman TV needs your help. So that as many people as possible can find us. We need you to share, like, tweet, and emote every episode you watch. We need everybody to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that we can monetize it.
Subscribing to the ORTV YouTube channel means you can re-watch your favorite or missed episodes whenever you like.
But to really help us, we need regular financial support to enable us both to sustain and to improve our programs.
Becoming a patron means not just receiving great merch, but also other privileged benefits like advanced viewings, premieres, sponsor surveys, unique interviews, and many other benefits, including a regular Mass intention.
Old Roman TV. Presenting the same faith. Today. As yesterday. For tomorrow. Old Roman TV. Presenting the faith of the ages. Enabling old Romans everywhere to remain steadfast in God's love.
Broadcast daily, the Mass of the Ages. Aired live, from the Brighton Oratory, England. Offered in Latin, with readings and homily in English.
Remembering the Incarnation. The Angelus. Broadcast every day. The Holy Rosary, recited daily online, uniting the old Romans around the globe in prayer with our Blessed Mother Mary.
Late Night Catechism. Where Angels Fear to Tread. Broadcast every Wednesday. Perennial teaching for the contemporary age.
Contra Mundum, Against the World, insightful commentary on issues affecting Christians in the 21st century, aired every Friday.
Every Saturday, Old Romans Unscripted. A weekly review and discussion of church headlines in the news, by Old Roman clergy from around the world.
Old Roman TV. Presenting the same faith today, as yesterday, for tomorrow.